One of the good things about publishing a magazine every month is that you can sometimes do something that will help you later on. We have just produced the American Opinion Scoreboard issue for 1972, which is normally our international issue. A great section of it this year is given over to international commentary. But this year, we have emphasized the domestic situation, analyzing each of the executive level departments of the Nixon cabinet over the last 4 years. One of the authors taking part in this massive analytical task will be our next speaker. He is author of an article in the July-August American Opinion entitled "The Economy, Departments of Commerce and Labor," and he will comment briefly on that subject. He is a former news editor of the Review of the News. He supervises the activities of such nationwide ad hoc committees as Train, Tax, Support Your Local Police, and the Movement to Restore Decency. He also serves as manager of American Opinion Speakers Bureau, which specializes in confirming engagements for conservative anti-communist lecturers. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Wallace W. Chip Wood.
Thank you very much, Scott. Ladies and gentlemen, being here with you today is an unexpected pleasure. And frankly, one, when I look at the array of talent at this head table, that makes me distinctly uneasy. I feel a little bit like Dean Martin walking unexpectedly into a temperance meeting, or Frank Sinatra to a school for gentlemen, or Bill Buckley to a rally for God, family, and country. With the exception of your present speaker, you are looking up here at the cream of Americanist and American journalists. And I have to be frank to say I don't qualify to stand up here. I am not a regular author. There are some who will contend I am not an author at all. But I discovered very quickly in the writing trade that I have a strange disease I think most of my compatriots have heard about, called literary hemophilia. I bleed a lot and don't recover quickly. Now, I don't mean to say that Scott is a tough taskmaster, although when he asked me to write an article for the Scoreboard issue, I felt a little bit like the galley slave pulling at his oar who was told by his captain that he had some good news and some bad news for him. The good news was that they would all be on double rations for the day, including an extra dollop of rum. The bad news was that after lunch, he wanted to go water skiing. No, you are seeing up here a number of gentlemen and lady with not only tremendous ability, but extremely tough hides. And in this business, they need them. Now, I have been told, and I believe, that the battle axe hanging in Scott's office wall is strictly for decoration. The ball and chain are never used, I'm assured. However, I did notice that when the room was rearranged, the decor in that part of the room was a deep, deep red. Well, frankly, why shouldn't he be demanding? Why shouldn't he ask the very best and then expect them to produce even better? He has the very best educational products available in the world. If you want to know what's going on and why and by whom, read Review of the News and American Opinion. There's nothing else to say. Well, there is one thing else to say. I'm going to slip in a commercial here. To read them, go into the Stanborough room when this gathering is over. The Stanborough room is where you'll find all of the exhibits for both American Opinion, the Review of the News, Western Islands, the John Birch Society, and our entire affiliated family. And just in case you or some of your friends might get lost, it is not to the right as you go out unless you want to make a 180-degree right turn. Then you'll find it on the other side of the mezzanine. Well, this morning Scott asked me to talk to you briefly about the subject of my article, which is the Department of Commerce and how it is aiding the communists, and the Department of Labor and how it is aiding the communists. Now, when Scott asks me to write something, I do precisely what he asks, because I know if I don't, he will blue pencil it. It will not appear in print. But when he asked me to speak, I knew his opportunity to blue pencil me would be rather limited. So I'm not going to talk about aid and trade. The subject of my present remarks are simple. You have been lied to. And I want to mention just 3 gigantic lies that the American public has been fed over the past 3 decades. The first lasted from the period of the 1940s through the 1960s. The lie was that our government was anti-communist. The truth is that from 1945 until 1968, the most powerful force promoting the growth of communism all around the world was the United States government. From China to Czechoslovakia to Cuba to Poland to Paraguay. It was officials representing us, using aid collected from us, that brought communism to power and kept it in power. With the Soviet Union alone, our aid and trade has been so extensive over the past 30 years that the most eminent authority in the world, Anthony Hutton of the Hoover Institution, has concluded that without it, Soviet communism would not exist today. The regime would have collapsed long ago. Beginning in the 1960s, American Opinion, and then later in the 1960s, joined by the Review of the News, started telling the American public the truth about this massive plot. We've exposed in these pages the companies sending aid to the enemy, the volume, the goods, the extent, the effect. Our publications were the first to break the story that there were American ships loaned to the communists at the end of World War II that were carrying goods helped produced by American firms into Haiphong Harbor to strengthen the arm of the Viet Cong. And again and again and again, our publications have told the truth. In fact, I personally believe that had there been an American Opinion magazine back in 1945, and a Review of the News magazine in 1945, and a John Birch Society to make their articles reach the public, tell the public the truth. Had we had all of those things 27 years ago, the battle would have been over and won today. But we lacked all of those things, and the first big lie succeeded. For 25 years, Americans believed their own leaders when they professed to be anti-communists. They were disturbed about the policies, and then came along a man who promised a change. And in 1968, another big lie was bought by too many Americans. The lie that Richard Milhous Nixon would change those disastrous policies. Many of you in this room tonight, this morning, it seems like tonight, whatever happened to last night? It just kept going on and on. I know that many of you in this room this morning recognized that statement 4 years ago for the lie that it was. Many of you had done your homework and done it well, and knew there was as much chance of Richard Nixon emerging as a hardcore, effective anti-communist president, that there was as much chance of that happening as there was of Elizabeth Taylor graduating with honors from Bob Jones University. Or of Ted Kennedy quoting one of our founding fathers and meaning it. The truth is that despite all of the promises, President Nixon has increased aid to the communists by at least 500%. Now, I'm not talking about propaganda effect or political value. I'm talking in terms of real dollars and real cents, or at least as real as they are today. He has taken a list of over 2,000 items that were marked as strategic under the rather liberal regimes of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. He's taken that list of 2,000 items and said, boys in Moscow and Peking and Romania and everywhere in between, order whatever you want. Whenever I hear talk about a restricted list being expanded anymore, I really get worried, because about the only things still restricted are nuclear warheads, atomic submarines, and manned bombers. And manned bombers will probably be the next to go. For the full story, or at least as much of it as could be fit into the pages allowed, about exactly what this man has done in this field, I would recommend reading the 1972 issue of American Opinion's Scoreboard. I hope and trust there is still no one in this room today who believes that we have in the White House the most vigorous, most honest, most candid, most effective, most American president we've had this century. If you still believe that, please don't leave the New England Rally without buying any book written by Gary Allen or any other author up here. Because once you do, and we can load you up with probably 300 titles, once you do, I don't believe you'll still be of that opinion. But that's the second biggest lie, and you've seen through that one too, that Nixon would change them. Now for just a minute, I want to talk about the third biggest lie, and one that unfortunately a lot of good Americans, a lot of well-informed Americans are buying today. And that is that your opposition is worthless, ineffective, and hopeless. That is the biggest lie of all, because to the insiders and the communists running the show, it is the most essential lie of all. They know better than most anti-communists that their whole edifice is a very shaky house of cards with no strong foundations, no pillars in truth and morality and honesty and integrity. It's built on very shaky reeds of lies and bluff and deceit. And all it's going to take to topple that whole house of cards is a strong wind of truth, and it will come down overnight. Now I know, all of you know, everyone up here knows, the battle sometimes seems difficult, but it should never seem impossible. I'd like to share a personal note with you for just a moment. It was exactly 13 and a half years ago this morning that I was living in Havana, Cuba, when the takeover occurred. Beginning just about this time, the rifle shots rang out. Loyal anti-communists were being shot down in the streets as Castro and his bearded bandits moved into the city. The havoc, the turmoil, the suffering, the bloodshed were unbelievable. Again, it was a result of policies and programs of our government that brought it into power. But even 13 and a half years ago, once the mass trials and purges began, even as bodies were falling with bullet holes in them, even then, communism could have been stopped in Cuba had enough people had the truth. That's all it would have taken. The attitude of the average Cuban up until that moment was that Castro was just another gangster on the make. The Cubans didn't believe he was the George Washington that Richard Nixon said he was, and the New York Times boasted he was. They thought he was just another crook coming in to clean up. Had they had the truth, and had enough Americans had the truth to force our government to change its policies, even after the collapse of the Batista regime, even after Castro seized power, he would have been thrown out. But the truth was withheld, and the country is now gone. And the blood of thousands of more Christian anti-communists is on the hands of Americans who stood by and let it happen. The point I want to make is that although we all pray this country never goes through again the kind of suffering that Cuba went through 13 years ago, even if things get that desperate here, even then truth could still defeat the enemy. If there is enough of it, shared widely enough by enough angry and determined people. Now, I don't think we have to go through that kind of collapse, that kind of bloodshed, that kind of horror. It can be stopped long before. All it will take are unswerving dedication and determination on your part and the part of every person you can reach. This is not a time to donate 1 or 2 hours a week or a month to the anti-communist cause. Not if you value freedom and your future. And I know you're not. I know you wouldn't have come here if you are. So I know that you'll join me in the prayer and the hope and the work to make it a fact that just a few more decades from now, your children's children and my children's children will still be able to tell their children about the great loyalties to God, family, and country. I hope and pray that 30 years from now, 60 years from now, another young splinter from the woodpile will be promoting American opinion in the review of the news and telling his friends that he thinks they ought to join the John Birch Society if they're worthy, as we must be. Thank you very much.
Which is entirely too typical of Chip. As you see, he's going back to work.